There's a phrase I hear constantly from sellers: we're only a little above market, we can always come down. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like a smart negotiating posture, and on paper it makes a lot of sense. Price a little high, leave room to negotiate. If nothing happens, adjust. But that logic assumes the market responds to pricing the way negotiation does, incrementally, rationally, with room to calibrate. It doesn't. The market responds to pricing the way a sorting algorithm does. It categorizes, and once your home is in the wrong category, the damage is already done, long before you ever get the chance to adjust. In this video, I want to explain why pricing just a little high is one of the most common and most costly positioning mistakes sellers make, and why the window to correct it is far smaller than most people realize. I'm Cucoch from LePage Signature, and I run a real estate team in the Mississauga and Toronto West areas. Whenever you're ready, there's a link in the description. If you want to book a call with me, I'm happy to chat. Let's start with how buyers actually process price. When a buyer is searching for a home, they're not evaluating each listing on its individual merits and then deciding whether the price is fair. They're scanning, they're filtering, and they're making split-second decisions about which homes deserve their time and which ones don't. And the primary filter is price range. Buyers search in bands. They don't type in an exact number. They set a range, say 800,000 to 900,000, and they scroll through what appears. If your home is priced at 919,000 because you want it to be just a little above the 900,000 mark, you've just disappeared from that buyer search. Not because your home isn't worth it, not even because the buyer wouldn't love it, but because they never saw it. You didn't lose a negotiation, you lost visibility. And visibility in the first week of a listing is absolutely everything. Now, let's say your price doesn't push you out of the search band entirely. Let's say you're still visible, but you're at the top of the range. Here's what happens. The buyer sees your home alongside 5 or 6 others in that range. The ones priced lower immediately feel like better value, even if they're not objectively better homes. Buyers don't do math in their heads when comparing listings. They feel their way through the comparison, and the feeling of being at the top of the price range is, this one better be exceptional. That's a brutal standard to meet in a photograph in a 30-second scroll. Your home doesn't just need to be good, it needs to feel like it justifies being the most expensive option in the set. And if that doesn't clear that bar instantly, the buyer moves on. Not to come back later, not to reconsider, they move on permanently. Because there are other homes that feel like better value at a lower price point, and attention does not circle back. This is the part that sellers consistently underestimate. The damage from being priced a little high doesn't show up as rejection, it shows up as silence. No one calls to say, your home is slightly overpriced and I'm choosing not to book a showing. What happens instead is that showings just don't materialize. Online interest looks modest. The listing sits quietly while the seller waits for a response that never arrives. And because there's no visible cause, the seller assumes the market is slow, or that buyers haven't found the listing yet, or that it just needs more time. But the market isn't slow, it's sorting. And your home has been sorted into a category that doesn't generate urgency. Not because it's a bad home, because the price positioned it against competitors it can't beat on first impression. Here's the deeper problem. The first 7 to 10 days of a listing are when the market pays the most attention. That's when the listing is new. That's when buyer agents flag it. That's when the algorithm on every platform pushes it to the most eyeballs. If your pricing is slightly off during that window, you've burned your highest attention period on a positioning mistake, and that period doesn't come back. You can reduce the price later, sure, sellers do it all the time, but a price reduction after 2 or 3 weeks sends a very specific signal to the market. It doesn't say, we've made this more competitive, it says, this didn't work. And buyers interpret that signal accordingly. They start wondering what's wrong with the home. They assume other buyers have already passed on it. They factor in the days on market and use it as leverage. The price reduction that was supposed to fix the positioning actually confirms the narrative the seller was trying to avoid. Now, you're not just competing on price, you're competing against the story the listing is telling. And that story is, something about this home didn't land. Let me put a number on this so it's concrete. Imagine a home that should be priced at $850,000. The seller lists at $889,000, just a little high, roughly 5% above where the market would have responded. In week 1, the listing gets moderate traffic, a few online saves, 1 or 2 showings, but no offers. In week 3, the seller reduces to $859,000. Now the listing shows a price reduction in the history. Days on the market are ticking. Buyer's agents are noting the trend. In week 5, the seller reduces again to $839,000, now below where they should have started, and they get an offer, but the offer comes in at $820,000 because the buyers know they have leverage. The seller ends up accepting $825,000 after negotiation. They started $39,000 above the right price, they ended $25,000 below it. That's a $64,000 swing, caused entirely by a pricing posture that felt like just a little high. Now, I'm not saying every scenario plays out exactly like that. Markets vary, homes vary, timing matters. But the pattern is remarkably consistent. Small overpricing leads to weak early traction. Weak early traction leads to price reductions. Price reductions lead to buyer leverage. And buyer leverage leads to outcomes that are worse than what the seller would have gotten if they priced correctly from day one. The gap between defensible and compelling is where this whole thing lives. A defensible price is one that you can justify with data. Based on recent sales, this number is within range. A compelling price is one that makes buyers act. It creates urgency, it generates multiple showings in the first weekend. It positions your home as the one to beat in its category. Those two numbers are often not the same, and sellers almost always gravitate towards the defensible number because it feels safer. But safe pricing in a competitive market often produces the least safe outcome because it doesn't generate the early momentum that drives strong offers. It generates quiet interest that slowly fades. There's another layer here worth understanding. When a home is priced slightly high, it doesn't just affect the listing itself. It affects how agents position it to their buyers. Buyer agents preview listings before recommending them. They look at the price, the photos, the location, and the comparison set. Then they decide which homes to show their clients. If your home is priced above what the agent believes it will appraise for, many won't even include it on the tour. Not because they're being unfair, because they don't want to waste their buyer's time on a home that will create friction at the offer stage. So your listing doesn't just compete with other homes, it competes with the judgment of every agent deciding whether it's worth showing or not. And that judgment is heavily influenced by where you sit relative to the market, not where you think you sit. Let me address the psychology behind why sellers overprice in the first place, because it's not irrational. Sellers anchor to what they've invested. They think about the renovation they did, the money they put into the roof, the property taxes they paid, the years of mortgage payments, and all of that creates an emotional floor, a sense of this is what the home is worth to me. But the market doesn't care what the home is worth to you. It cares what it's worth relative to the alternatives. And the alternatives don't know about your renovation, your mortgage, or your emotional connection to the property. They only know what they can see, what they can compare, and what they're willing to pay for the option that feels best to them. That gap between what the home means to the seller and what it represents to the buyer is where overpricing quietly takes root. And the seller doesn't even realize it's happening, because from their perspective, the number makes perfect sense. It just doesn't make sense to the market. There's also the agent dynamic worth addressing. Some agents agree to a higher price to win the listing. They know the home should be listed lower, but the seller wants to try at a higher number and the agent doesn't want to lose the business. So they agree, let's try it and see. But let's try it and see is not a strategy. It's an experiment with your leverage as the variable. And by the time the experiment produces results, the results are already negative. The first 2 weeks have passed, the home has been categorized, the narrative has been set. And the price reduction that follows isn't a correction, it's a confirmation that the original strategy was flawed. This is why the pricing conversation matters so much before a home goes live, not after. Not once the feedback starts coming in, before. Because by the time feedback arrives, the positioning has already done its work. The first impression has already been made. The sorting has already happened. And course correcting after a weak launch is fundamentally harder than getting it right from the start. I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting sellers should underprice their homes. That's a different conversation with its own nuances. What I'm saying is the margin for error on the high side is much smaller than sellers think. Being 5% too low might leave a little money on the table, but it generates competition, urgency, and multiple offers that often push the price back up. Being 5% too high doesn't just leave money on the table, it removes the conditions that create a strong sale in the first place. The asymmetry is real, and it's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. If you're thinking about selling and you're wrestling with the pricing question, which most sellers are these days, the most valuable thing you can do is stress test your pricing posture before you go live, not after. That's the core purpose of a strategic listing readiness review. It's not about picking a number, it's about understanding how the number positions your home in the competitive set that exists right now. What category does it put you in? Who are you competing against at that price? Does the number create urgency or complacency in the buyer pool? And most importantly, is the price defensible or is it compelling? Because those are two very different things. And the difference between them is often the difference between a home that sells strongly in the first 10 days and one that slowly erodes on the market over 6 weeks. If that kind of clarity would be useful before you list, there's a link in the description. In the next video, I'll explain why the online interest your listing is getting, the views, the saves, the clicks, might not mean what you think it means.